The day she picked up the silver locket, Clara had no idea that this small object held the secrets to a lifetime of mysteries. In a town where everything seemed calm, a story began that would shake the very foundation of those involved. How can one truly understand a mother's pain and sacrifices when she hides them from the world? Today, a line in an old will, an arrested reverend, and a long-lost name will come together to unravel a puzzle no one ever imagined. There's something deep here, something hidden, and with every step, a new challenge awaits. After today, nothing will ever be the same again. The morning unfolded like a canvas painted with the soft, restrained hues of an English spring, the sky a delicate pale blue, the sunlight polite and gentle, as though it too were treading lightly upon the earth. The air was fragrant with the faint scent of wet soil, a lingering reminder of the evening rain. The villagers of St. Mary May, each donning their hats tilted at just the right angle, their gloves perfectly immaculate, made their way with quiet solemnity towards the chapel. Their footsteps were light upon the flagstone path, the sound muted, as though they were all in reverence of the sacredness of the moment. Today, however, was different. The usual vicar, an older man known for his frequent coughs and sermons that tended to stretch just a little too long, was absent. In his place stood a visitor, Reverend Simon Blythe, newly arrived from the northern reaches of the country. He was of average height and middle-aged, yet there was something about his presence, a subtle, tightly wound restraint, that suggested a man not so much at peace with God, but at odds with his own soul. As he spoke, his voice was deep and steady, though every word was chosen with the gravity of someone carefully weighing their own conscience. His gaze, however, seemed to wander, not across the congregation, but beyond them, searching for something or someone, not entirely present in the room. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap, did not watch him with the same intent gaze as the others. She listened, yes, but more than that she noticed. She noticed the brief tremor in his hand, as he turned the page of his Bible, the slight pause before he uttered the words, "The wages of sin," and the subtle way his breath caught when the choir's voices rose behind him. It was a voice trained in righteousness, yes, but now it trembled with something else, an emotion buried deep beneath the surface. As the candles flickered under the painted arches of the chapel, there was a moment, fleeting yet unmistakable, when something in his expression faltered. It wasn't the usual respectful silence one might expect in a house of worship. This silence was thick with tension, the kind that makes the air feel heavier, and causes people to clutch their handbags just a little tighter. Reverend Blythe had stopped mid-sentence, his voice suspended in the air, like a curtain that had been suddenly dropped. He placed one trembling hand on the lectern, the other moving to his chest, as though some invisible weight had suddenly descended upon him. A collective shift occurred in the pews, a rustle of confusion, followed by the sound of hymnals falling to the floor. Miss Marple, always quick in thought but modest in movement, was already rising. By the time Reverend Blythe crumpled behind the pulpit rail, she was at his side. Others rushed forward, Dr. Gibbons from several rows back, and young Mr. Finch, eager to be of assistance. But it was Miss Marple who knelt first, gently adjusting the clerical collar that had twisted during his fall. His skin was pale, not just from illness, but from something deeper, something that spoke of an inner affliction beyond mere fever or fatigue. For a brief moment, his eyes fluttered open, and in that fleeting window of consciousness, he reached up with surprising strength, grasping her wrist. His lips parted, and in a voice barely audible beneath the high-vaulted ceiling, he murmured 6 words, words that sent an icy shiver through the room. "God knows what I've done." And then, as quickly as he had spoken, he closed his eyes again, retreating back into the darkness of unconsciousness. It was a strange thing, Miss Marple thought later, how the human heart can discern between the incoherent babblings of delirium and a confession spoken from the very edge of guilt. She said nothing aloud, of course not yet, but in the quiet tilt of her head, in the narrowing of her eyes as she studied the Reverend's face, a question had already begun to form. By Monday morning, the news had settled over the village of St. Mary Mee, like a delicate frost, cold, lingering and ripe for gossip. It was the talk of the town, shared over buttered toast at Mrs. Bantry's, where some mused that some men simply weren't suited to the pulpit. At the grocer's, Miss Hartnell speculated it was a heart condition, while at the post office, Mrs. Tilling confided that she never trusted a clergyman who didn't blink when you mentioned judgment. Miss Marple, however, did what she always did in such matters. She listened, not just to the words that were spoken, but to the spaces in between, to the subtle hesitations, the forced reassurances, the deliberate choices of what was said over what was not. She had seen many men faint, and more still who wore their private sins beneath their public collars. But there was something else about Reverend Blythe's collapse. It was not sudden, nor was it the theatrical fall of a man seeking sympathy. It was gradual, restrained, as though the body, like the soul, had reached its breaking point, weighed down by something far darker than what could be seen on the surface. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, but Miss Marple was already deep in thought, her mind turning over the strange incident, piecing together what had been said, what had been left unsaid, and what remained hidden in the silence that followed the Reverend's faltering words. As the first light of dawn painted the sleepy village of St. Mary Me with a pale golden hue, the air felt heavier, thick with something unspoken, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. The villagers, all accustomed to the soft rhythms of their quiet lives, moved about in their usual morning routines, some heading to the market, others to the chapel, their steps measured, deliberate, but today, there was an unease that clung to the edges of the day. Miss Marple, sitting by the window, her cup of tea in hand, stirred a spoonful of marmalade into the steaming liquid, but her mind was elsewhere, caught on the memory of Reverend Simon Blythe's strange collapse the day before. The way his fevered hand had gripped her wrist, the almost painful intensity in his eyes, and those 6 words that had slipped from his lips, words that were neither a prayer, nor a plea, but a confession so resigned, so final, that they hung in the air like a thick fog. God knows what I've done. It was a statement not of guilt, but of acceptance, as if the Reverend had already made his peace with whatever shadows lurked in his past. That afternoon, while the sun still clung to the horizon, Miss Marple wrote a simple note to the vicar's wife, offering her help should any nursing be required, though she knew in her heart that the illness the Reverend suffered from was not one that could be healed with mere tending. Some wounds, she thought, ran deeper than the body. Some maladies were born not in the flesh, but in the soul. As she folded the note, her thoughts turned, not to physical sickness, but to something far darker, penance. It was just past midnight, when the sound shattered the calm of the night. Low, deliberate tolls echoed from the chapel's belfry, 12 in all, ringing with a sense of urgency that was impossible to ignore. The villagers, those few still awake, glanced at their clocks in confusion, while those fast asleep stirred restlessly beneath their covers, registering the eerie sound as if in some distant half-formed dream. Some whispered of bad omens, of spirits yet unsettled, but it was Miss Marple who sat perfectly still in her parlor, her embroidery resting untouched in her lap, the air around her thick with expectation. She did not glance at the clock, nor rise to investigate. She simply tilted her head slightly to one side, her eyes narrowing as she listened, because she knew with a certainty that gripped her heart that bells did not toll themselves. The arrival of Reverend Blythe had been received with typical politeness. The villagers, ever courteous, had extended the kind of welcome that was more about form than genuine warmth, an acceptance of change in theory, but not in practice. Reverend Blythe, sent to tend the flock while Canon Weatherby recovered, had a certain nervousness about him. His appearance was immaculate, his mannerisms polite to the point of discomfort, and though he read evening prayers with an almost theatrical gravitas, there was a coldness in his smile that suggested it was not warmth, but something else that guided his every move. Mrs. Weatherby, who had managed the vicarage since her husband's illness, remarked to Miss Marple that the Reverend seemed decent, but tired, perhaps worn from the burdens of his new post. Miss Marple, with the quiet observance she was known for, had merely nodded, but privately, she wondered whether it was true fatigue, or something far more sinister, that haunted the man. The villagers noticed the small things, the subtle deviations from the norm, how the Reverend avoided the elderly, how he fled the breakfast table early each morning, how his eyes lingered for a fraction too long on the portrait of the former vicar's daughter that hung in the hall. No one could pinpoint what was wrong, but in St. Mary Me, such nuances never went unnoticed. It was during the next Sunday's evening song, as the congregation sang the third hymn, that Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something in Reverend Blythe's behavior that others might have missed. As the faithful voices rose, he remained silent, his hands clasped tightly on the lectern, his gaze distant, fixed not on the altar or the choir, but on the dusty ledger of hymn choices hanging on the north wall. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like a moment of deep reflection, but to Miss Marple, it was a pause filled with discomfort, a hesitation that betrayed more than just thought. Later, as the service ended, and the villagers filtered out of the chapel, Miss Hartnell, ever the gossip, greeted the Reverend with a remark that was both innocent and pointed. She mentioned, almost casually, that she believed she had seen him years ago at St. Aldhelm's home in Wiltshire. At this, a strange stillness passed over Reverend Blythe. His smile faltered for the briefest of moments, and though he nodded, there was a shadow in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps something darker, something he wished to remain buried. That night, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlor, the faint sound of the bells still echoing in her mind. She did not doubt for a moment that something was amiss, but the question remained, what had the Reverend done, and what was it that he sought to escape? The tolling bells, the confession, the strange unease in his every gesture, they were all pieces of a puzzle. But what picture would they form? The answer, Miss Marple knew, was already hidden in plain sight, waiting for her to unravel it. As Miss Marple stirred the marmalade into her tea that crisp morning, the sensation of Reverend Blythe's hand on her wrist still lingered in her mind. The warmth, the tension in his grip, and the feverish glint in his eyes, as he uttered those 6 words. Not a plea, not a prayer, but a resigned statement of inevitability. She wondered about his true nature, about the weight of his past that seemed to haunt him. Her fingers paused, the spoon stilling mid-air, as she recalled his words echoing like a dark secret he could never quite shake off. In the hours that followed, her thoughts drifted from illness to something more ominous, penance, perhaps, or the scars of a past life refusing to fade. She wrote the note to the vicar's wife with practiced care, offering help should any nursing be needed. Yet even as she folded it, her mind turned back to the Reverend, and the shadow that clung to him. It wasn't until the stillness of midnight, when the bell tolled 12 times from the chapel tower, that the village of St. Mary Me stirred, a haunting sound, deliberate, ancient, as though a forgotten omen was waking. Those still awake glanced at their clocks in mild alarm, while others stirred restlessly beneath their quilts, the bells echoing like an unsettled dream. But Miss Marple, ever observant, remained in her parlor, her embroidery untouched, her eyes fixed on the window, listening intently to the sound. She knew what others didn't. The bells had a purpose, and they weren't tolling by chance. Reverend Blythe's arrival in the village had been polite but distant, marked by an odd formality that rubbed against the grain of St. Mary Me's usual warmth. The villagers, ever courteous, extended their welcome, but there was an undercurrent of quiet wariness. His nervous mannerisms, the avoidance of wine, the forced smiles, the way he withdrew from conversations, particularly with the elderly, spoke of something far more unsettling than simple exhaustion. Miss Marple had noted the unease in his eyes, the way his gaze lingered on certain things with too much attention, as though the past were never far behind. The moment at Sunday evening's service, when Reverend Blythe had faltered in the hymn, was no less telling. His hands, once poised on the lectern, stilled as his eyes fixated on the north wall of the chapel, where an old ledger lay. The congregation's voices filled the silence he left, but Miss Marple could feel the tension in the air, thick as if he were battling a silent internal storm. It was only later, outside the chapel, that Miss Hartnell, with her keen eye for detail, had remarked upon the Reverend's strange demeanor. Her casual mention of a possible prior meeting, years before in Wiltshire, had sent a ripple of unease through the group. The mention of St. Aldhelm's home, and the story of a missing girl from years past had struck a chord, and though Miss Marple hadn't voiced it, she couldn't ignore the connection. Something about the Reverend's past was hidden, wrapped in a veneer of civility, yet it was there, lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't until Lily, tasked with airing out the guest room, discovered the hidden parcel beneath the floorboard, that the truth began to unspool. A locket, aged and worn, with a portrait of a young girl, and a lock of hair, was revealed, and though Lily had shown it to Mrs. Weatherby, it was Miss Marple's trained eye that noticed the subtle signs, how the clasp appeared broken, as though the locket had been worn, and then hastily discarded. The subtle impression of violence left in its wake stirred a sense of urgency in her. Later, over tea with Mrs. Bantry, the conversation, as it often did, drifted to the Reverend. Bantry, enjoying the drama of an old tale, mentioned the mysterious disappearance of the young girl, and the subsequent vanishing of a curate from the same town. A chill ran through Miss Marple, as she remembered the case vaguely, how a young clergyman had fled in the wake of scandal, never to be seen again. She wondered, not for the first time, if the Reverend Blee had truly come to St. Mary Me to escape his past, or if he had come to bury it for good. Something was not right, and as the days passed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit into place, each clue more chilling than the last. The quiet reverence of the village hid the dark secrets that lingered just beneath the surface, secrets that only Miss Marple, with her sharp eye and deeper understanding, could hope to unravel. By Saturday morning, the village was abuzz with a disturbing new tale. Widow Carter, usually spry and sharp-witted despite her years, had been discovered in her garden, slumped near the rosemary hedge, her apron torn and a dark bruise marking her wrist. Gibbons, summoned hastily, attributed it to a fainting spell, but the marks left on her skin suggested something more sinister. She couldn't recall the events that led up to her collapse, only that she had stepped out to tend the garden, and awoke later, damp earth clinging to her knees, a sense of unease settling heavily in her bones. Miss Marple, who had heard of the incident through the Morning Post, stared out at her own flower bed, noticing that the early rosemary had begun to bloom, an oddly unsettling thought, as if nature herself had taken notice of the events unfolding. Widow Carter, though tough and seemingly immune to the ailments that often plague those her age, had never failed to appear at market before, making her absence all the more conspicuous. Her niece, when Miss Marple paid a visit under the pretense of delivering a lemon sponge, assured her aunt was simply tired, but the light in the widow's eyes when she managed to recognize Miss Marple said otherwise. As Miss Marple adjusted her bedding, the old woman's eyes fluttered shut, and from her cracked lips came the breathless words, "He buried her beneath the rosemary." The words hung in the air, fragile and chilling, and Miss Marple, ever perceptive, felt a heavy weight settle over her mind. In a village where secrets hid in plain sight, nothing spoken by a near-sleeping soul could be dismissed lightly. The next morning, on her customary walk, Miss Marple made an unannounced detour, passing Widow Carter's garden. The rosemary, thick and wild, caught her eye, not just for its age, but for the way a small patch of it had been disturbed. The soil was freshly turned, and though she would never trespass, she bent close enough to see a cloth pouch peeking out from beneath the surface. Lifting it delicately, she opened the drawstring to reveal a child's rosary, the beads a pale pink, the cross worn smooth by time. One bead, however, was missing. She studied it for a long moment before placing it carefully in her reticule. In isolation, such a trinket might hold no significance, but combined with the widow's cryptic words, and the Reverend's trembling sermons, Miss Marple began to see a darker thread weaving through the events, a thread that could lead to a girl once lost to time. Her disappearance perhaps connected to the Reverend, in ways no one had yet dared to imagine. As Sunday approached, a subtle shift overtook the chapel. The Reverend's voice, once calm and steady, now carried a new unsettling urgency. Gone was the comforting tone of duty and charity, replaced with fiery rhetoric on sin, reckoning and judgment. A judgment not from man, but from something far older and more unyielding. Mrs. Bantry, whispering to Miss Marple after the service, remarked how the Reverend's words now seemed more Old Testament than the gentle teachings they had once known. Miss Marple, sitting in her usual pew, listened intently. It was not just the words, but the way the Reverend gripped the lectern too tightly, his gaze flitting nervously toward the windows, as he spoke of fire and divine retribution. His cadence had changed, the rhythm charged with a new intensity, a feverish energy that set her nerves on edge. This was no ordinary sermon. There was something hidden in his words, a truth he was struggling to keep buried. And Miss Marple, as always, could feel the faintest stirring of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface. The Reverend's voice, once strong and certain, faltered abruptly in the midst of his sermon, a strange crack cutting through the reverent silence of the chapel. It was the kind of break in a voice that no one could fail to hear. Some whispered it was due to illness, others speculated it was the weight of the recent strain he had been under. Years of relentless pressure and internal turmoil. But Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, knew better. She had long since learned to trust patterns over appearances, and in that moment, something deep within her stirred. It wasn't just the physical tremor in his words that caught her attention. It was the subtle shift in the air, the unspoken confession hidden in his faltering voice. There was a certain kind of guilt that people wore like a second skin, one that when left unaddressed, manifested as a crack in the voice, when under scrutiny. It was often the guilty who, faced with the weight of their actions, began to speak too much or too little, their words betraying them when silence could no longer protect them. And something about this man, in that moment, spoke of a truth desperately trying to remain hidden. As the days passed, Miss Marple, ever discreet in her investigations, began to work quietly behind the scenes. Posing as a curious member of the Parish Historical Society, she set about making inquiries with the gentleness of someone who merely sought information out of interest, but with the precision of one who knew exactly what to ask. Her questions were always indirect, her tone always vague, yet there was something in her approach that had a remarkable way of unlocking doors that others had closed with no intent to reopen. Over the years, she had perfected the art of getting the answers she needed, never asking a question that shouldn't be asked, but always knowing exactly whom to ask. By Thursday afternoon, a simple brown envelope arrived on her doorstep, sealed with the official insignia of the diocese. Inside were photocopies of several old faded documents from St. Alhelm's Home for Girls, dating back decades. As she carefully examined the pages, one name immediately stood out like a shadow in the light. Clara Finch, a 16-year-old girl admitted to the home in March of 1910. Her file was not lengthy, but it was enough. The final entry, dated barely a year after her admission, read chillingly, "Runaway vanished, presumed willful flight." There were no follow-up notes, no indication that anyone had made an effort to find her, no mention of a family being contacted, no police investigation, nothing. The absence of any formal inquiry was as striking as the absence of the girl herself. For a home under the direct administration of the church, such a lack of due process was highly unusual, and Miss Marple found herself unsettled by the whole matter. She sat back, deep in thought, after reading the file. There was something terribly wrong with this case. Girls didn't simply vanish without a trace. Miss Marple knew that even in the most ordinary of disappearances, there were whispers, fragments of memories from staff or residents, and the quiet weight of guilt on the shoulders of those who failed to protect them. But Clara Finch's disappearance was different. There was no closure, no investigation, just an abrupt and chillingly final statement: presumed willful flight. That phrase, presumed willful flight, Miss Marple knew all too well, was the kind of language used by those who wished to close a case before it was fully understood. Language that had little to do with truth, and everything to do with convenience. Something didn't add up, and Miss Marple was determined to find out what. The following Sunday, as she spent the morning in the chapel library, perusing the hymnals and prayer books, Miss Marple found herself drawn to an old edition known for its misnumbered index. It was a curious little detail, something that had always fascinated her, and she often leafed through its pages when the library was quiet. This time, however, her hand brushed against something unexpected, a yellowed piece of paper, folded carefully between the pages, aged with time. It was a page torn from a diary, the ink faded but still legible, and a small blot at the bottom corner suggested it had been hurriedly written in a moment of distress. Miss Marple's heart skipped as she began to read 21st April. He says he will come tonight. The rest of the entry was fragmented, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. Mentions of a promise to a child, a meeting that would take place that very night, and the name of a man, Father Simon. The name was underlined twice, as if the writer was trying to emphasize its significance. Miss Marple paused, the words echoing in her mind, and then it hit her. Father Simon, an innocuous title perhaps in the world of the church, but Miss Marple knew that among frightened girls, such titles often held much more weight. Father Simon was not just anyone. Simon Blythe, the current reverend, had never mentioned any previous parishes, had never offered any real history of his life before arriving in the village, and yet here, in her hands was a piece of the past, something no one else seemed to know. The name Simon Blythe, and the girl's diary entry were too much of a coincidence, and the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more certain she became. This was not an innocent man, nor was Clara Finch the first victim of a much darker story. She carefully placed the hymn book back on the shelf, but not before tucking the torn diary page carefully into her own diary for safekeeping. Too many names now haunted her thoughts. Clara Finch, Simon Blythe, and now this other unnamed child, whose name had been hidden between the lines of the diary entry, trembling with fear. The past, once buried under layers of silence, was beginning to speak again, and the voice it carried was not one of innocence. It was just after morning prayers, when young Peter Davies, who had been tasked with sweeping the nave, stumbled upon something that would shatter the fragile peace of the church. The body was found cold and lifeless, tucked away in the shadows of the chapel. Peter ran, panic rising in his chest, understanding that some things were far too terrible to face alone, and some truths were far too dark to remain hidden. The chapel, once a place of comfort, now stood as a grim witness to a secret long kept and a horror about to be exposed. The grim discovery of Mr. Pritchard's lifeless body, crumpled at the base of the bell tower, sent a ripple of unease through the village. But it was the unnatural twist of his limbs, and the strange positioning of his spectacles, a full yard away from his body, that made it clear that something far darker than a simple fall had occurred. Gibbons, summoned to the scene, quietly pronounced it a probable accident, though his words faltered as he examined the break in Pritchard's neck, which suggested an angle entirely inconsistent with an ordinary stumble. The stairs, though steep, had been climbed by Pritchard daily for over 2 decades without incident. His long familiarity with the tower should have made any misstep impossible. Yet Miss Marple, who arrived under the pretext of delivering lavender to the vestry, stood at a distance and observed not the body itself, but the eerie stillness surrounding it. She noted the lack of any marks on the ground, no scuff marks, no blood, no sign of a struggle or a fall, and above all there was no attempt to grasp the sturdy railings that flanked the tower's narrow stairwell. The silence around the body was unnerving, but it was Pritchard's frozen expression that truly unsettled her. It wasn't fear or surprise that marred his features, but something more profound, an expression of weary astonishment, as though he had witnessed something incomprehensible, something he could neither understand nor escape. The villagers, murmuring of accidents and clumsy missteps, did not notice the subtle details that Miss Marple's sharp eyes absorbed with unerring precision. As the constable made his notes and the reverend offered his soft prayers, she stood at the door of the belfry, her mind already working through the details that others had overlooked. It was then she detected something curious, a faint scent of frankincense, a fragrance clinging to the air like the ghost of some long-forgotten ritual. It was an odd thing, considering no incense had been burned in the chapel since Easter. Yet the scent lingered, a soft reminder of something that had been left behind, an echo of a secret long buried. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she examined the tower's floor, dry, clean and utterly undisturbed. Not a single scuff mark marred its surface, no sign that anyone had climbed or descended the stairs that morning. Mr. Pritchard's death, of that she was certain, had not been an accident. That evening, when Mrs. Weatherby sorted through the deceased man's effects, a small object fell from his overcoat, an object Miss Marple immediately recognized. A single rosy pink bead, faintly iridescent, identical to the one she had found in Widow Carter's garden. The rosary, once missing a bead, had now found its way into the dead man's coat. It was a simple thing, but Miss Marple knew that such details were never truly simple. 3 days prior, Miss Marple had spent a quiet afternoon in the vicarage garden, when she happened to glance through the parlor window. There, just beyond the rose bushes, she saw Mr. Pritchard standing close to Reverend Blythe. The exchange between them was brief, yet tense. Pritchard's arms were crossed with an unusual firmness, his posture rigid, as if in disapproval, while Blythe, his face taut with strain, attempted to maintain composure. No words were spoken, no gestures made, but Miss Marple had seen enough to know that something had transpired between the two men, something unspoken, something deeply troubling. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Disagreements were common, even among the devout, but now with Pritchard dead, a rosary bead in his coat, and the scent of incense where none should have been, Miss Marple could not ignore the mounting questions. What had Pritchard confronted Reverend Blythe about? And more importantly, what had Blythe feared Pritchard might reveal? Inspector Graves, though competent, lacked the subtlety Miss Marple knew was required for such a delicate matter. He had handled accidents and occasional misdirected cows with ease, but this case required a mind sharp enough to pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding the church and its inhabitants. Miss Marple, quietly observing from the edges, knew the answers lay not in the obvious clues, but in the unnoticed details, the hidden tensions, the small seemingly insignificant objects, and the unspoken fears that hung in the air like an unvoiced prayer. Something was terribly wrong, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the truth. Inspector Harrow arrived at St. Ethelreda's, just as the fading afternoon cast long shadows across the cobbled courtyard, his steps purposeful yet devoid of drama, his breath forming soft clouds in the crisp village air. From a distance, the death of Mr. Alcott, the chapel's elderly groundskeeper, appeared simple enough, a tragic but natural end. An old man found at the base of the bell tower, limbs arranged oddly, neck at an angle no living body would bear. The inspector glanced up at the worn steps spiraling into the dim height above, and declared in professional tones that it was most likely a fall, slippery stone, poor lighting, or the exertion of old age. He noted the absence of witnesses, the lack of blood, and no immediate signs of foul play. To most it would be sufficient. But to Miss Isadora Wynne, seated in the third pew with her gloved hands folded neatly, and her eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a modest hat, it was far from closed. She was no stranger to death, nor to the village's quieter undercurrents, those whispers that flowed beneath polite conversation like hidden rivers under ice. She had seen in Mr. Alcott's expression, not the fear of a man who had slipped, but the stillness of one who had surrendered. His lips parted slightly, not in shock but as though whispering a name. That and the curious scent of burnt myrrh, an incense long unused at the chapel, and locked away in the sacristy, hinted that something ancient and deliberate stirred beneath the surface. And then there was the folded paper, found lodged in the man's coat lining, aged and fragile with water stains. Its ink faded but not gone. She saw me bury it behind the old crypt. If she speaks, it ends for us both. The note bore no signature, no salutation, only urgency. It was not the first time Isadora had seen such desperation written in trembling script. Her memory, sharp despite her years, drifted to whispers from long ago, of a girl named Lillian Cross, who had once lived in the church orphanage, spirited away in 1913, after a quiet scandal involving a clergyman, and a fire that destroyed the East Wing records. Her name had surfaced again, scratched beneath a pew with a sewing pin, nearly invisible unless one knew where to look. Curious, Miss Wynne paid a visit to the vicarage, under the genteel pretense of delivering a jar of quince jelly, and found the maid, Edna, pale and distracted, her hands trembling as she poured tea. With gentle persistence, Miss Wynne coaxed from her the story of Reverend Alden's sleep-ridden confessions, murmurs of guilt, half-formed names, and the words, "She wouldn't stop crying. I didn't mean to. I didn't know what else to do." These were not the cries of a murderer, Miss Wynne thought, but of a man drowning in memories too terrible to forget. The next day, she visited the grounds once more, directing her gaze to the soil near the old crypt. A subtle depression in the earth, surrounded by small stones deliberately arranged, caught her eye. She returned that night with a trowel, cloaked in darkness and determination, and unearthed a rusted tin box. Inside, a charred length of cloth, the corner of a baptismal certificate, and a silver brooch etched with the initials LC. Each clue added weight to the growing shape of a truth long buried. Not a fall, but a reckoning. Not an accident, but a silence maintained through guilt and fear. The chapel's hearth, long cold, now seemed less a place of comfort, and more a tomb of secrets, the kind only old villages and older sins can foster. Miss Wynne, in the quiet solitude of her parlor, laid the items out before her, each one a relic, not only of a lost girl, but of the crumbling walls of men who thought time would keep their secrets safe. The inspector would file his report, and return to town. But Miss Wynne knew the past did not die. It waited, and now, after all these years, it had found its voice again. Only the faint echo of a sentence remained, fragile, burned at the edges like parchment singed by truth too long buried. Its tone darkened with something unmistakably bitter, desperation. Miss Elowyn Gray stood frozen, the slip of paper trembling slightly between her fingers, as her gaze held it for a long breathless moment in the flickering candlelight of the rectory library. Around her, the room seemed to press inward, as though listening. The message was incomplete, yet devastating in its implication, fragmented words that, like broken glass, still cut deep. This wasn't some faded memory, or forgotten act of youthful error. No, this was careful deliberate concealment. It was the armor of silence forged to protect reputations, the sharp-edged secrecy of a past too ugly to speak aloud, and the chilling weight of a child's terror long ignored. Each word in that scorched sentence clung like a bloodstain to the unfolding mystery Miss Gray had only just begun to piece together, a web woven not with lies, but omissions, whispered warnings, and eyes that looked away when they should have screamed. The child, whoever she had been, hadn't vanished into time. She'd been smothered by it, erased with precision, and only now did her silence begin to crack through the seams of polite society. Colonel Harold Whitcomb, once the iron voice of village authority, and now a faded figure in the background of community meetings, had begun to crumble under the weight of time. His mind faltered, his recollections flickering like a flame at the end of its wick, moments of sharp clarity, swallowed suddenly by fog. It was during a seemingly meaningless visit. He had returned a copy of Ecclesiastical Fortifications of Southern Britain, that the air changed. He had stared absently at the mantel and whispered, unprompted, to no one in particular. That priest, it was all for her, her silence, our peace, all of us. Then, as if he hadn't spoken at all, he muttered something about missing choir robes and the harvest fair, drifting back into his haze. But Miss Gray had heard. She'd heard the words beneath the words, the penance that lingered like rot beneath polished surfaces. Colonel Whitcomb, she recalled, had once served on the board of St. Osyth's Home for Girls. Then came Mrs. Aldridge, housekeeper of the old Trevington estate, who had worked in silence most of her life, and learned how to survive in a world that punished curiosity. But one late afternoon, under a sky choked with clouds, and a wind that seemed to carry old secrets, she finally spoke. It began with mundane chatter, baking, broken fence posts, the vicar's sore throat, but then drifted as though guided by unseen hands to St. Osyth's. I was young, she said slowly, eyes not meeting Miss Gray's, but I remember long corridors, the echo of shoes on stone, and a girl. She cried every night, not because she was hungry, or even cold. She cried because she knew something terrible, something no one would let her say, until one day she just stopped. Her voice faltered, and she offered no more. But Miss Gray needed no further elaboration. She could already feel the pieces aligning. A girl, Corinne Lath, briefly mentioned in an old parish death notice with no recorded parents. A visiting priest, Father Lyle, transferred with no ceremony after an alleged incident that was never entered into church records. A midwife's ledger kept meticulously for years, suddenly missing pages from a single spring. It all pointed to a child born in secrecy and buried in silence. And then there was the bracelet, delicate, tarnished silver, engraved with a single A, found buried beneath the rotted floorboards of the vestry during the recent renovation. The air in that room had turned inexplicably cold when it was unearthed. Lady Trevington, whose memory was as sharp as her tongue, took it to her cousin in Dover, a retired curator who once specialized in ecclesiastical heirlooms. The verdict was swift and chilling. The design matched a rare commission, given only to children born under the guardianship of the diocese between 1929 and 1932. Children not claimed. Children quietly placed. Children never spoken of. Miss Gray, upon hearing the confirmation, said nothing at first. She simply stood by the window of her small sitting room, watching the mist creep across the village rooftops, like the slow unraveling of a long-held lie. But inside her, the threads had fully pulled taut. This was not the tale of a girl who disappeared, but one of a child erased, her cries ignored, her presence treated as an inconvenience. It was not sin that had stained the past, but the fear of its consequences, fear so deep that even decades later, it made old men mutter in confession to empty rooms, and women weep over forgotten names. The silence wasn't just breaking, it was howling. The ghost wasn't in the chapel, or the corridors of the home. It was in the people, in what they had done, in what they had allowed. And now Miss Gray knew, the past was no longer content to rest quietly. It was awake, and it was coming. Beneath the flickering candlelight in the quiet stillness of the vestry, Evelyn Moorcroft's eyes caught a glint, a shimmer not of decoration but of memory, something secret and old, hidden deliberately behind a loosened stone near the altar. It was a silver locket, aged and darkened with time, yet untouched by dust, as if someone had placed it there recently, carefully, like a wound stitched shut and buried beneath skin. To a passerby, it might seem insignificant, but Evelyn knew at once, it was a relic of something unspoken, not forgotten, a symbol of silent promises and suppressed truths. It pulsed with the weight of something long concealed, a confession not voiced but cast in metal when words had lost all meaning. And in her gut, Evelyn felt the bitter certainty that Reverend Aldwyn Vexley, the once solemn and steadfast man of God, whose sermons had once lulled the village into peace, had buried more than keepsakes. He had buried the truth itself. And now it was clawing its way back. By the following Sunday, the church felt different. The air was heavier, the pews colder, and the pulpit, once a place of comfort and salvation, had transformed into something else entirely, a stage for reckoning. The Reverend, who once spoke with tempered grace, now delivered his sermon like a man possessed, his voice quivering with fire and fury, rising and falling in unsettling crescendos that made even the faithful shift uncomfortably in their seats. His eyes bloodshot and frantic, never settled, darting over the congregation like a hunted man searching for shadows. Gone were the messages of mercy, in their place came ominous visions of divine fire, of wheat scorched in judgment, of sins unnamed yet deeply felt. He spoke of truth clawing its way through stone and silence, of secrets unable to remain buried. Villagers whispered that he had taken ill, while others, driven by fear and superstition, murmured of possession, of a spirit unsettled. But Evelyn, sitting quietly in the back, heard something else entirely. It wasn't madness, It wasn't divine inspiration. It was the voice of a man unraveling under the weight of a truth he could no longer carry. His words, though cloaked in scripture, were soaked in guilt, trembling with fear of being discovered. Then the second blow came, more cruel than the first. Elsie May, barely 10, soft-spoken and bright-eyed, was found dead at dawn by the groundskeeper, her small frame placed tenderly in the baptismal font, as though some twisted reverence had guided her killer. Her hair was damp as if recently washed, her hands folded in perfect prayer. No bruises, no signs of violence, just silence, thick, unnatural silence, that clung to the chapel walls like cold breath. The Reverend locked himself inside the vicarage, refusing to speak, refusing visitors, while the villagers stood frozen in their grief and dread. Evelyn, refusing to be still, began collecting hymnals for safekeeping. An act of routine, perhaps, or of ritual. Between Abide with Me and Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past, she found a torn scrap, tucked tightly between pages as if hidden in desperation. The handwriting was unmistakable, Clara Finch's, shaky and urgent. They mustn't find her. She cries for me at night. I hear them. I'll hide her near the elder tree. She'll be safe there. She must. Evelyn read the words twice, her breath catching not in surprise, but in grim understanding. Clara hadn't fled. She had stayed long enough to protect someone. Her child. Her child. And now someone had killed Elsie, to keep that secret buried forever. That night, the wind didn't blow, but the bell above St. Agnes Chapel began to toll. Slow, heavy, deliberate chimes that echoed through the stone like footsteps from the grave. 13 times it rang. Not 12. Not the hour of prayer. This was different. This was remembrance. The village stirred in uneasy sleep, their dreams soured by the weight of something ancient and cruel reawakened. But Evelyn remained seated in her drawing room, still and alert, the note resting on her lap, her fingers unmoving, her eyes fixed on the firelight dancing across the window. She knew that hour too well. Nearly 15 years ago, in a locked attic room in Wiltshire, Clara Finch had gone into labor, unseen, unblessed and unrecorded. Her child born in silence, her name struck from memory, her cries never heard beyond that room. Only one person had whispered the time of birth to Evelyn years later, midnight and 13 minutes, the same exact hour the bell now marked. This was no coincidence. This was a summoning. Someone had returned to that chapel, not to mourn, not to repent, but to remember, and perhaps to finish what had once been interrupted. Whether it was guilt, grief or madness that drove them no longer mattered. The dead had stirred, the truth had shifted beneath the soil, and the time for silence had ended. Evelyn rose slowly, the locket in one hand, the torn note in the other, and as the bell's final chime dissolved into the night, she knew what was buried beneath this village wasn't just a child. It was history's shame, and the echo of a crime that refused to stay forgotten. And now the reckoning would not stop until every secret had been dragged, screaming into the light. The bell's mournful toll cut through the stillness of St. Elora's like a blade slipping beneath skin, not loud, but precise, purposeful, like a message buried in time finally clawing its way back to the surface. It was not just a bell, it was a reckoning. On that overcast Thursday afternoon, with the garden swaying under grey skies, and a hush heavy enough to choke, Eleanor Wren sat quietly across from the rector's wife at a table laid out with precision, seed cake in perfect squares, cucumber sandwiches arranged like chess pieces, and Darjeeling tea, steeped so carefully it felt ceremonial. The rector's wife, a woman not prone to gossip yet vulnerable to memory, let her thoughts wander aloud as she stared out at the hedges, her voice trembling ever so slightly as she mentioned the midnight chimes, the child's disappearance, the rector's strange silences and even stranger sermons. Eleanor barely moved. She didn't need to. Her stillness was that of calculation, of pieces gently falling into place. The rosemary bush disturbed not by wind or dog but by fingers. The old rosary unearthed with damp beads still clinging to soil. The torn sketch of a girl with corn gold hair and wide frightened eyes tucked into the back pages of an unused hymnal. Eyes that knew something. Eleanor had once been a schoolteacher, then a war nurse, now a quiet observer of human frailty, and she knew how trauma left fingerprints where no eye could see, in glances, in silences, in the way the rector's hand trembled when he touched the baptismal font, or the way he flinched at the sound of children laughing. The rector's sermons had changed, no longer filled with comfort or community, but with veiled threats and cryptic parables about judgment, burial, cleansing through sacrifice. The wife had begun to notice too. His sleepless nights, his murmured prayers that didn't sound like prayers at all. And once the strange marks on his wrist, red and raw. And Eleanor, who had pieced together a child's name from an old register and a photograph hidden behind an organ panel, had begun to see it all clearly. The girl who had vanished decades ago, thought to have run away but never truly searched for. The curate who had been moved without question after whispers at the girl's home. The silence paid for with charity and cloaked in scripture. What had happened in that chapel all those years ago had never ended. It had only gone underground, like rot beneath floorboards. And now the rot was rising. The bell tolling 13 was not a mechanical mistake. It was a cry, a warning, or perhaps a confession. Cecilia's disappearance was not isolated. It was repetition. It was legacy. And in the way the rector's wife clutched her teacup, hands trembling as if she remembered something she hadn't admitted even to herself, Eleanor knew it was time. The truth was not just a puzzle to solve, but a wound to open. And it was bleeding again. What was once hidden in a garden thick with rosemary, beneath a sky that had watched silently for too long, now refused to remain buried. Eleanor set her cup down softly, deliberately. The time for reflection had passed. It was now time to name the dead, and to reckon with the living. Because some sins don't die. They simply grow roots. He served the chapel not with affection but with discipline. A man whose faith was not adorned with sentiment but armored with understanding. The rituals were his clockwork, the shadows his comfort. Mr. Haldon, the stoic sexton of St. Catharina's, had spent decades among pews and gravestones, his presence as dependable as the rustle of cassocks or the creak of wooden benches. Yet in the final days of his quiet life, it was what he chose to notice, what he deliberately preserved, that made his death feel less like a closing chapter, and more like the ripping out of a page. Agatha Penmore, known for her silence and her precise memory, had watched him for years, but never more closely than after his body was found, twisted at the foot of the bell tower stairs, face to the stone, fingers still curled around a broken slat of wood, as though clinging to a truth too dangerous to speak. The whispers began quickly. Accident. Exhaustion, perhaps a stroke. But Agatha heard what others didn't. The stories told by the details he left behind. A child's locket, dulled by time, hidden in a crack beneath the pulpit floor. A single page torn from a hymnal with ink smudged by fingertips not yet dry. And a scent, frankincense, deep and old, clinging to the vestry like a memory that refused to dissipate. These were not relics. These were warnings. Haldon, in his final weeks, had not stumbled upon secrets. He had unearthed them carefully, intentionally, laying them out like pieces on a chessboard where each move forced the next. The Reverend Emery had not been blackmailed in the vulgar sense, but manipulated by silence more deafening than confession. Haldon had spoken little, but what he didn't say weighed heavier than scripture. Glances, pauses, carefully timed absences. It was enough to make the Reverend sweat through his collar, and lose the rhythm of his sermons. And then there was Lily, sweet, trembling Lily, whose death had been wrapped in language like fragile and unwell, words that stung Agatha as cowardly evasion. Lily had been afraid, yes, but not weak. Her final week was full of tiny deviations, trays left untouched at the Reverend's door, footsteps heard at hours when no one else stirred, her voice faltering when she admitted to Agatha, barely above a whisper, that the crying started again, just behind the vestry door. It wasn't the living that haunted St. Catharina's, but the memory of one the child Clara had never named, the one spoken of in lowered tones and buried with no marker. Agatha came to believe that Lily had heard enough, perhaps seen too much. A glimpse, a conversation unfinished, something barely understood but deeply dangerous. She wasn't silenced by hatred, but by the trembling desperation of a man standing too close to spiritual collapse. The font, meant for rebirth, had been turned into a drowning place, and the most sacred spot in the chapel had become a grave for the innocent and the truth. Yet even in death, Lily had resisted erasure, a pressed flower left on a nameless grave, a final hymn sung twice during a cleaning, a look she gave Agatha in passing, all breadcrumbs, subtle and heartbreaking, left for someone who might care enough to follow. And follow Agatha did, not with confrontation or outrage, but with care. She wrote no accusations, she summoned no constable. Instead she composed a short, elegant note to Mrs. Emery, suggesting a memorial for the recent losses, to unite the village in remembrance, she said. And so they gathered. Reverend Emery, gaunt and ghosted by guilt. Mrs. Cantwell, tight-lipped and too still. Colonel Harwood, who hadn't climbed the chapel steps in years. And Agatha quiet in the last pew, hands folded but eyes sharp. As scripture echoed under the stone arches, she watched, not the grieving, but the guarded, the ones who flinched at the wrong lines, whose stillness betrayed storms beneath. This was not just a service, it was an unspoken trial. The church held its breath. The bell did not ring, but the silence did. And Agatha, heart steady, knew this was the moment truth stopped whispering. It had begun to scream. The weight of the week's events hung thick in the air. The usual buzz of conversation dampened into an eerie silence, leaving the congregation subdued. Their voices were hushed, as though each word spoken could shatter the delicate tension that had settled into their bones. There was a perceptible shift in their demeanor, less talkative, more alert, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the heavy sorrow that now cloaked the chapel. St. Mary's, a place once full of warmth and light, now felt as though it was slowly sinking into its own history, carrying with it the weight of a tragedy that would not be so easily forgotten. The incident that had taken place in this intimate sanctuary of faith had altered something fundamental. It did not announce itself loudly, but quietly nestled into the shadows, carving a permanent scar into the very soul of the place. At the front, the altar stood stark, draped in pristine white linen, a solitary candle flickering with fragile defiance, casting long trembling shadows on the stone floor. The light flickered with an almost mournful air, as though it too was aware of the gravity of what was unfolding. Reverend Blythe stood behind the lectern, his presence no longer commanding. He had once been a figure who commanded respect, his voice bold and unwavering as it soared through the sanctuary. But now, there was a hollow emptiness about him. His posture was stiff, too rigid, like a man bracing against a storm he could not see or control. His hands were stiff on the lectern, fingers pressing into the wood as though he might break free of the invisible tide of guilt that seemed to swallow him whole. His eyes, once sharp and clear, were now dull, glazed over as if he had retreated far from the present moment, unwilling to face the truth that had been laid bare before him. His voice was faint, soft and disconnected, lacking the fervor it once held. The words came in fragmented bursts, as though they were too heavy to bear. It was a voice that barely cut through the thick silence in the chapel, and even those who heard it seemed to strain to listen, unsure if they had even caught the full weight of what was being said. Miss Marple, however, was a different presence altogether. She did not occupy her usual spot among the congregation. Instead, she stood by the side aisle, her figure slender and unassuming. But in that quiet space, she was a force to be reckoned with. Her hands were loosely clasped before her, her demeanor serene, yet there was an unmistakable air of determination around her. She made no grand gesture, asked for no permission to speak. There was no fanfare or announcement, only the quiet resolve of someone who had seen things far darker than the eyes could fathom. When she stepped forward, it was as though the air around her thickened, and every eye in the room fell upon her. The silence stretched in all directions, as if even the church itself was holding its breath. Her voice, when it finally came, was not raised in anger or accusation. Instead, it was calm and steady, the words flowing with an almost haunting precision. She did not demand, nor did she scold. She simply spoke, revealing the truth that had been concealed for so long, peeling back the layers of secrets like an onion, one thin skin at a time. The words were unassuming, but carried a weight that seemed to make the air heavy with expectation. The congregation, despite their collective unease, fell into an unnerving silence. They could not look away. Her words wove a tale of betrayal, of secrets hidden for far too long, and of a past that had come back with a vengeance. She spoke of Clara Finch, a name that would be forever etched into the history of St. Mary's, Gaz, though none had dared utter it in years. Clara, a young girl of quiet beauty, intelligence, and a charm that had once captivated the heart of a young curate. A curate who had once seen the world through idealistic eyes, but whose naivety would soon be shattered by the weight of responsibility he had never expected. Clara's fate had been sealed in silence. There were no fanfare, no celebrations, no records, just a whisper, a secret buried in the corners of the chapel, where no one dared venture. The Reverend Blythe, then still a man of promise, had been complicit in her quiet disappearance, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of the scandal that would undoubtedly follow, fear that his carefully constructed future, built on the fragile walls of reputation and piety, would come crumbling down. Clara was sent away, disappeared, quietly dismissed under the guise of disobedience, and her child, born not in sin, but in secrecy, was hidden away. A silent reminder of the life that had been swept beneath the rug. The rosemary in Widow Carter's garden, that wild, untamed herb, had once stood as a silent witness to the life that had been carried in shadows, the secret that none would speak aloud. And yet, Miss Marple, pausing for only a moment, allowed her words to linger in the air. She allowed the truth to sink deep into the hearts of those who listened. She spoke of how Clara, though silenced by fear for years, had eventually found the courage to speak. Time had a way of changing things, awakening hidden truths that had long been buried. Clara no longer wished to fade into obscurity. She no longer wanted to be forgotten. She wanted to be seen, by the world, by the church, by the man who had once held her heart, and now stood in the pulpit, shielded by his own hypocrisy. Clara's letters had begun to arrive, quiet at first, tentative, then more demanding. She had not come with threats of violence, but with the quiet desperation of a mother, who had nothing left to lose. She had sought recognition for her child, for herself, for the truth that had been buried beneath the cold, oppressive weight of secrecy. The Reverend Blythe, now a figure of renown and power in the church, feared the consequences of Clara's words. But it was not just his reputation he feared. It was the unraveling of the life he had built, the one he thought he could keep hidden behind a veil of piety and devotion. And so, Miss Marple's voice lowered, not in theatrics, but in respect. She spoke softly now, as though handling something far more delicate than anyone could understand. The congregation held their collective breath as she continued. Clara Finch was last seen beneath the shadow of St. Mary's Chapel. No carriage came for her. No train ticket was ever purchased. Her child was left in the care of another, and the Reverend Blythe, by then newly renamed and transferred, was never questioned. The silence that followed was thick, laden with the gravity of what had been uncovered. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the room, her words hanging heavy in the air. The past, as we all know, is never buried completely. It finds its way into the present. It seeps into our dreams, into the hours when we least expect it. The bells of St. Mary's still toll at the hour when a child once cried. The truth had been spoken, not with the force of a dramatic confession, but with the quiet, undeniable finality of something long overdue. The congregation was left in stunned silence, their minds whirling with the weight of what had been laid bare before them. Clara had spoken, not in her voice, but in the shattered lives she had left behind. Her silence had cracked open the hidden chambers of St. Mary's, and now the truth could no longer be contained. Miss Marple, her eyes fixed on Reverend Blythe, knew he was ready to speak, yet she held him in a delicate web of silence, her gaze unwavering as she tugged at the threads of the narrative. Her voice, now low but thick with purpose, cut through the air with a measured calm that contrasted sharply with the storm raging within the room. It was not a hesitation but a quiet knowing, a gravity, that only those who had seen the deepest shadows of the human soul could understand. She began, her words deliberate, slowly unraveling the secrets held for far too long, as if this were a confession that would reverberate through the very bones of St. Mary's itself. Widow Carter, a woman of silence but sharp, discerning eyes, had once worked in the reverent halls of the Grand Aldelms estate. There, within the house's quiet walls, she'd witnessed the growing unease of Clara Finch, who had withdrawn into herself, her once vibrant spirit, now overshadowed by an isolation too deep to ignore. Carter had felt it first, the subtle change in the air, the way the other staff avoided Clara's gaze, as though she carried a burden too heavy for anyone to touch. It was Carter who found Clara after the child was born, wrapped not in joy, but in the quiet desperation of a young woman lost to the world's cruelty. There were no cries of celebration, only the hushed prayers whispered over the swaddled child, as though the world was not ready to know their secret. With a courage that transcended the ordinary, Widow Carter became not a savior, but a shield, taking Clara and her newborn to St. Mary's under the guise of a distant relation's recovery. For a brief time, they were safe, but safety, like a fragile bloom, never lasts long. As whispers began to swirl and questions edged closer, Clara's resolve crumbled, and she insisted that the child be taken elsewhere, to a remote cottage far to the north, where they would be forgotten, or so she hoped. The papers were never signed, the records erased. Clara Finch vanished from the world's memory, but not from the echoes of those who had known her. Widow Carter, bound by her silence, never spoke of Clara's disappearance, not when she had vanished again, nor when Reverend Blythe returned, cloaked in a new name, a new life. Yet Carter bore the weight of those years with quiet resignation, tending her rosemary, a quiet witness to the sins that could not be erased. When the widow's body was found, bruised, broken, and buried within the familiar confines of her own garden, what struck most was not the brutality of her death, but the painful clarity of her remembered truth. Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly toward Reverend Blythe before she continued, unyielding, her voice like the final toll of a bell. I do not excuse Mr. Pritchard, yet I cannot condemn him fully. He was a hard man, yes, practical, and more concerned with control than compassion. But he was not a man of cruelty, he was a man of leverage. She paused, her words heavy in the air. Some months before his death, Pritchard had begun repairs on the vestry floor, and in the process, he uncovered an old locket, wrapped in cloth that seemed untouched by time, bearing the image of a girl long forgotten. He said nothing at first, but something in him shifted after that day. Perhaps he had found a misplaced diary entry, or maybe, late one night, he had seen Blythe, eyes dark with some unknown purpose, slipping incense into the brazier, an ancient rite for a sin buried too deep to remain hidden. Miss Marple's tone grew softer, yet more certain, as if she could see it all unfold before her. Whatever the catalyst, Mr. Pritchard knew, and once he did, he waited, not to expose, but to ensure silence. He made his knowledge known in quiet ways, a sharp comment, a lingering look, just enough to make Reverend Blythe's eyes flicker, enough to make his sermons falter. She glanced back at the Reverend, whose silence spoke volumes. It began, Miss Marple suspected, as a quiet game of power. Perhaps money changed hands, perhaps it didn't, but Reverend Blythe knew, and silence could be negotiated or removed. Pritchard's fall from the bell tower was not a simple accident. It was the grim conclusion to a negotiation. With his death, the final wall between Blythe and exposure crumbled. There was no wound, no blood, no witness, but Miss Marple, who had once been young herself, knew the quiet unraveling of a secret. Lily, the sweet-natured servant girl, had been trusted with the smallest tasks, tea trays, linens, turning down beds, but those small gestures had brought her ever closer to the private rhythms of the house. She had overheard the murmurs behind closed doors, the subtle signs of unrest, the restless pacing of a man trapped by his own guilt. Once, she had paused too long near Reverend Blythe's study, and heard a confession, whispered, trembling, barely spoken. "I didn't mean to hurt her." Miss Marple let the words settle, watching as the room held its breath, waiting for the full weight of the truth to land. As the last echoes of the village bell faded, Miss Marple stood amidst a fragile silence, the truth unfolding in waves, each revelation heavier than the last. The room was heavy with the weight of unspoken things, and even the faintest creaks of floorboards beneath the weight of those who dared to listen seemed to reverberate with the gravity of the moment. The story had woven its dark threads deep into the fabric of the village, where secrets festered in corners hidden from the innocent. Widow Carter, once a simple seamstress, had harbored not only the memory of a woman scorned but the frail, silent remnants of a tragedy, buried beneath years of unspoken grief. Clara, young and vulnerable, had found no comfort in the words of those who were meant to protect her, and the baby, a whisper in the shadows, was a reminder of the horrors hidden beneath the surface. But Widow Carter had been no hero. She had been a silent witness to the years of whispered rumors, the growing dread that clung to the walls of St. Aldelm's, where everything sacred had become a masquerade of lies. And when Clara had vanished into the night, so did the whispers, silenced but not forgotten, not by the woman who held the secrets like a treasure trove of regret. Even when the Reverend Blythe returned to the village under a new name, the past had crept back like the slow encroachment of twilight. He had buried the truth beneath layers of sermons, his voice faltering not in confession, but in the cold, deliberate silence that spoke louder than any prayer. Yet it was Mr. Pritchard, a man of power and quiet menace, who had stumbled across the remnants of that dark history, hidden in the crevices of the church he tended so meticulously. The old locket, wrapped in cloth untouched by time, was not just a relic of a forgotten life, it was a key to a door that no one dared to open. And yet when Pritchard found it, something within him stirred, a deep, unsettling knowledge, that perhaps by knowing, he could control the tides of history. He made no move, not immediately, but there was a change in him, a knowing that seeped into his every word and gesture, causing the Reverend's carefully constructed facade to tremble. Miss Marple, in her quiet observance, had seen it all unfold, the game of power, the quiet leverage, the slow disintegration of innocence. But it was not just about exposure, it was about something far deeper, something that could not be erased by time or silence. Lily, a young girl with no taste for scandal, had become an unwitting observer, hearing things she was not meant to hear, seeing things that would haunt her forever. Her silence was not born of ignorance, but of fear, the kind of fear that clung to the edges of a life too fragile to break. And when Lily's presence became too much of a threat to Reverend Blythe, the chapel became the place where her story ended. But not just her life, her memory, too. Her death, so quiet, so final, was no accident. It was the culmination of a history that had been sealed in blood and silence. And when Miss Marple spoke those final words, it was not justice she sought, but remembrance. Not the justice of courts or laws, but the quiet justice that comes with acknowledging what should never have been hidden. The chapel, once a place of rebirth, had become a tomb for the truth, but in the stillness that followed, a strange kind of peace began to settle over the village. The Reverend's fall from grace was not a spectacle, but a quiet negotiation, a trade made in shadows, the price paid in whispers. And when he confessed, it was not to the law, but to the walls that had witnessed too much to ever forget. His words, soft and tremulous, echoed in the air, not as a confession of guilt, but as a surrender to a truth he could no longer escape. The villagers, still shaken by what they had learned, returned to their routines, their lives forever marked by the knowledge of what had lived among them. Yet in the corners of St. Mary, something began to bloom, a quiet truth that had lain dormant for too long. Widow Carter, though scarred by the weight of years, returned to the churchyard not with words but with seeds, as though nature herself held the power to heal the wounds time had left behind. The rosemary she planted, thick and fragrant, began to grow, a symbol not of the past but of a future, where remembrance, not judgment, would take root. And though the villagers did not speak of Clara directly, there was a quiet understanding that something had been set right. It was not a story of vengeance or retribution, but of acknowledgement, of the healing that comes when the truth, no matter how dark, is finally allowed to breathe. And when the letter arrived from Canada, It was not just a note from the past, but a reminder that some stories, no matter how buried, are never truly forgotten. Clara, though lost to time and memory, had left behind a legacy that would not be erased, not by the village, not by the reverend, and not by the passing of years. Some truths, like the rosemary in Clara's corner, continue to grow, quietly persistent, long after the last words have been spoken. A mother's secret, once fragmented and hidden, like a silver locket lost to time, had finally found its way back into the light. A delicate pendant that had arrived on her daughter's birthday, a silent witness to the years of secrecy and sorrow that had followed. The locket had been a symbol of a life long hidden, and it was on the same day that the letter was placed in the will, a cryptic message about a daughter hidden away, placed in care for her protection. A child, whose very existence had been erased from the world's memory, her fate sealed by the silence of a mother who had fought not just to protect her, but to keep her hidden from the cruel judgments of a society that could never understand. For years the daughter had searched once, twice and then again, but the answers eluded her, swallowed by the passage of time, and the fear of what might be uncovered. The past had been buried deep, told to her as a story better left untold. But now, after so many years, a solicitor had reached out, reopening a chapter long forgotten. A reverend, once trusted by all, now arrested. His part in this tangled web had always been suspected, but never dared spoken. The mystery, which had seemed so impenetrable, began to unravel, slowly, with deliberate steps. The truth was not revealed in an outburst of dramatic confession, nor in a public reckoning, but in the soft, delicate words of a letter, carefully written and folded with grace. Clara Finch's name, once erased from the world, had been brought back into the light, like the faint glow of a star. After years of darkness, the letter spoke not of vengeance or anger, but of an unexpected and strange comfort. A daughter now understanding that her mother had not abandoned her. No, her mother had fought quietly, bearing the weight of her choices, suffering in silence, and protecting her with a love so fierce that it could not be spoken, could not be shared. For so long, it had been locked away, like the locket that had been lost and forgotten. Miss Marple, after hearing the letter read aloud in the stillness of the room, closed her eyes for a moment, her mind turning the pieces of this intricate puzzle. She knew, as she always did, that justice came in many forms, some of it loud and brash, but most often it arrived in whispers, soft, patient, and only when the heart and the village were finally ready to receive it. The day was quiet, the sun gentle in the sky, and Miss Marple found herself sitting with the vicar in the garden once more. The air was still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The tea between them had gone mostly untouched, but neither of them seemed to mind. Their conversation shifted, and for the first time in a long while, they spoke not of sin or scandal, but of burdens, of the weight people carried, the ones that were imposed upon them, and those they chose to carry on their own. The vicar confessed that he had long suspected something was amiss, but he had never known the shape of it, never known how deep the shadows went. He had seen the signs, the distant look in Reverend Blythe's eyes, the moments when his sermons became too fervent, too desperate, but he had mistaken it for passion, for virtue. Like so many men of the cloth, he had believed that silence was a form of righteousness. Miss Marple, whose life had been filled with the understanding that silence could never be mistaken for peace, simply nodded. She spoke softly of guilt, how it was a seed that once planted, never truly died. It grew, twisting and curling in the dark, always searching for a way into the light. And sometimes, she said, it could only be uprooted when someone was brave enough to face it. Their conversation lingered on the subject of girls like Clara, those whose stories had been brushed aside, labeled as inconvenient, irrelevant, or even imagined. How many had there been, whose lives had been ignored because they didn't fit the narrative that society wanted to believe? Miss Marple knew that there were always more stories, stories hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, waiting for the right moment to come into the light. She thought of the locket, the missing bead, the rosaries tucked away in forgotten drawers, and the bells that rang, not just for the passing of time, but for the souls lost in the silence of forgotten truths. The tea between them had long cooled, but Miss Marple's mind was still racing. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drawn out to the garden beyond the window. The light caught the leaves in a way that seemed almost like a poem, like a verse waiting to be written. In that stillness, she thought of everything that had led up to this moment. The cruelty, the cowardice, yes, but also the protection, the resilience, and the quiet remembrance of a life long hidden. Not all stories, she realized, were told with triumph or punishment. Some were told with restoration, with the quiet unfolding of a truth that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Justice, she knew, was not always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes, it was the smallest whisper, the faintest hint of a truth that had been buried for far too long. And in this small peaceful village, where nothing ever seemed to change, justice had bloomed once again, allowed to grow and stretch into the light. Miss Marple thought of the broken locket, the beads that had been scattered, the forgotten girl whose name had been lost to time. She thought of the priest who had made choices long ago, choices that had haunted him, choices he had tried to bury, to protect his own secrets. But in the end, it was the quiet persistence of a truth that had finally been allowed to surface. Even in a place like St. Mary Me, where silence was the norm and secrets were often left to fester, the weight of those hidden stories had been felt. It was not just a story of murder, Miss Marple realized. It was the story of a child hidden in shame, of a mother forgotten by the world, and of a priest who had mistaken silence for salvation. But in the end, the past had been given its rightful place, not in punishment, but in quiet dignity. And as Miss Marple sat in the stillness of the garden, her teacup in hand, she knew that the smallest gestures often carried the heaviest weight. It was not the loudest voice that had uncovered the truth, but the gentlest gaze, the one that saw beyond the brokenness, beyond the mistakes, and found the redemption that had always been there. Justice, she thought, had not come through the law. No, it had come through remembrance, a name restored, a story told, and a truth finally heard. The village, once so still, had quietly shifted, and the weight of its forgotten past had finally been allowed to breathe again.